London was still a city scarred by fire when they arrived, young, loud, unmistakably American. Their boots hit the streets in a rhythm the British hadn't heard in years, confident, steady, almost defiant. People leaned out of office windows. Shopkeepers stepped out onto cracked pavements. Children stared like they were watching giants. And somewhere in that crowd, half hidden behind his iconic hat and heavier than usual silence, stood Winston Churchill. For 2 unrelenting years, he had shouldered a nation's fear. He had given them words when they needed strength, resolve when they needed courage, and hope when hope seemed absurd. But on this gray afternoon, with thousands of fresh American troops marching through the battered heart of London, something shifted inside him. He didn't give a speech. He didn't wave dramatically. He just watched and whispered a single line that revealed everything he had carried, feared, and finally believed. A moment so small it could have passed unnoticed, yet it reshaped the future of the war. Before we dive deeper into this powerful moment in history, make sure to like the video, subscribe, and share it with anyone who loves gripping wartime stories. Your support helps us bring more untold moments like this to life. Thanks. Now let's continue. London in early 1942 was a city that didn't just look tired, it felt tired. The Blitz had ended months earlier, but the scars were everywhere. Entire streets still sat open to the sky, jagged brick walls rising like broken teeth where homes used to stand. Blackened outlines of firebombs stained the pavement. Windows were patched with cardboard. Even the air held a faint metallic smell of dust and old smoke, as if the city itself was still exhaling from the nights it had fought to survive. Every Londoner carried that exhaustion differently. The mother who instinctively glanced upward at the hum of any aircraft. The bus driver who navigated streets where entire blocks had vanished. The shopkeeper counting out ration coupons with a smile that never quite reached his eyes. Yet, beneath that exhaustion, there was something almost defiant. A quiet, stubborn refusal to break. Londoners still queued politely, even in rubble. They still joked, still scolded each other for cutting lines, still made tea in kitchens where half the roof was missing. The city had become a living contradiction. Wounded, but unbowed. Weary, but unbroken. Still, for all that resilience, people wondered privately how much longer it could hold. Britain had been fighting alone for so long that occasionally, late at night, the question crept into even the bravest minds. What if help never truly comes? They knew the Americans were in the war now, at least on paper. Pearl Harbor had dragged the United States into the global conflict, and newspapers printed headlines about declarations of war and promises of aid. But promises didn't patch broken streets or replace the lives lost in bomb shelters or bring back the steady rhythm of normal life. People had heard that American factories were roaring to life, that ships were crossing the Atlantic loaded with tanks and food and supplies. Yet those were distant facts, useful, necessary, but abstract. Nobody in London had seen the American war effort with their own eyes. And in wartime, abstractions don't lift spirits. People do, faces do. Boots marching down real streets do. What Londoners saw every morning were neighbors leaving for work with rations in their pockets, fire wardens watching the skies, and soldiers who had already been fighting for years, their youthful energy worn down by the weight of war. Everyone knew Britain could hold on. They had proved that in 1940 when the Luftwaffe tried to break them from the air. But holding on wasn't winning, it was merely enduring. And endurance, no matter how noble, eventually frays. The city needed something more than speeches and courage. It needed a visible sign that the world had finally come to stand beside it. That was the miracle people didn't dare say aloud. The hope that one day they would look down the street and see fresh, young allies marching toward the fight instead of another weary British regiment heading out of it. Meanwhile, morale fluctuated like the winter weather, sometimes bright, sometimes bitter. The government did its best to keep spirits up, but propaganda films and posters could only do so much for people who were stretching every scrap of food, every piece of clothing, every ounce of energy. Nights were quieter than they used to be, but quiet in wartime never felt safe. It simply felt like an intermission before the next act of uncertainty. British newspapers tried to reassure the public that stronger days were coming, printing photographs of Roosevelt and Churchill smiling together, publishing optimistic predictions about increased American support. Many Londoners clipped those articles out, tucked them in diaries or pinned them above fireplaces as reminders that somewhere out there, a powerful friend was awakening. But deep down, most people felt the same hesitant mixture of hope and doubt. Yes, America had joined the war, but would they arrive in time? Would they arrive in force? Would they arrive at all before Germany reached a point of no return? In pubs, conversations often drifted to the same theme, relief that America was finally fighting, mingled with the lingering fear that Britain might still need to weather the worst on its own. The city was suspended between dread and anticipation, bracing itself for whatever came next. And in the middle of all this stood Winston Churchill, a leader who had become both a symbol and a shield for his people. Londoners didn't know the full weight he carried, but they could feel it in the set of his jaw and the intensity of his speeches. They saw him walking the ruins after air raids, leaning on his cane, his hat tilted against the wind, his face lit by the glow of fires still hissing from the night's destruction. To the public, he was a fortress of willpower. To his closest circle, he was a man pushing himself to the edge of what one person can bear. Churchill knew Britain had done the impossible by surviving 1940, but he also knew survival wasn't victory. Britain needed manpower, machinery, ships, and above all, partners. Real ones, not promises, not paperwork, not crates of supplies in docks. Allies standing beside them, ready to fight. He believed America would come. He believed it fiercely. But belief doesn't quiet the ticking of time, or erase casualty reports, or fill the empty bunks of fallen British airmen. So even Churchill, the man whose voice had carried a nation through its darkest nights, waited alongside his people for a sign that Britain wouldn't have to stand alone forever. London didn't just want a miracle, it needed one. And though nobody knew it yet, that miracle was already crossing the Atlantic. For most of Britain, Winston Churchill was the unshakable voice of defiance, the man who turned speeches into armor and words into lifelines. But behind the public roar was a private reality that few ever saw. A man who carried the weight of national survival on his shoulders every single hour of the war. When he walked through bombed-out neighborhoods, Londoners saw determination in his stride. But his advisors saw something else, the slight sag of someone who hadn't slept. The tightness in his expression after reading casualty lists that never seemed to shrink. Churchill was famous for his bulldog spirit, but even bulldogs break when enough pressure is applied. He hid it well, of course. He laughed loudly at dinners, barked orders with his usual theatrical flourish, and insisted on projecting strength in every photograph and broadcast. But in private, he confided to his doctor that he often felt as if he were swallowed by a black dog, a darkness that crept into the corners of his mind when the nights were particularly quiet, or when intelligence reports painted a future he couldn't bear to voice aloud. Britain had survived the Blitz, but survival wasn't victory, and Churchill knew better than anyone how thin the line between the two really was. His closest staff witnessed the toll. They saw the way he paced the floors of Chequers long after midnight, cigar smoke curling above him like restless ghosts of the war's unanswered questions. They heard him muttering through drafts of speeches, rewriting each line until it struck precisely the chord he needed the nation to hear, not too bleak, not too hopeful, always balanced on that razor's edge between honesty and vital fiction. They watched as telegram after telegram arrived from military commanders, begging for reinforcements, tanks, planes, anything. And they knew the agony behind Churchill's eyes when he had nothing left to give. Britain's resources were stretched to the point of transparency. Every new demand felt like pressing a bruise that had never healed. But the harshest burden wasn't logistical, it was emotional. Every decision he made sent young men into deadly fighting. Every miscalculation cost lives. He carried each loss personally, storing them away in a mind that refused to forget. At times, he confided to his private secretary that he feared becoming the man who presides over the ruin of his own nation. For all his bravado, Churchill was haunted by the possibility that Britain might collapse on his watch, not for lack of courage, but for lack of help. And yet, Churchill's hope rested not on Europe, which lay in ruins under German occupation, nor on the Soviet Union, whose fate hung by a thread on the Eastern Front, but on a distant nation thousands of miles away, the United States. His conviction in America's eventual involvement was almost a faith more than a policy. He had grown up with an American mother, spent time touring the U.S., and believed deeply in the shared values of the English-speaking world. But belief didn't guarantee action. He knew the United States was divided, hesitant, suspicious of foreign wars. He sent letter after letter to President Roosevelt, carefully crafted, deliberately personal, nudging American policy inch by inch without ever pushing so hard it snapped. His advisors saw the pattern. Churchill's writing became almost tender when addressing Roosevelt, weaving strategy with sentiment, diplomacy with friendship. But for all the warmth, the truth was cold. Churchill was betting the survival of his nation on a man he had never actually met in person until the war had begun. He feared, quietly and deeply, that if America didn't step in soon, Britain might simply run out of time. Every night he scanned reports from across the empire, seeing evidence of strain everywhere. He was, at his core, a man praying for a partner who had not yet stepped fully onto the stage. That private fear made what happened in 1942 all the more profound. When Churchill learned that American divisions were finally mobilizing, finally preparing to cross the Atlantic in large numbers, something inside him loosened, a tension that had lived in his chest since the fall of France. But the relief was cautious, fragile, almost hesitant. Until he saw them, until their boots touched British soil, he feared it could all still slip away. He feared isolation, feared delay, feared that the miracle he had whispered for, in moments of exhaustion, might dissolve into another headline of political debate in Washington. So while London held its breath for change, Churchill carried a quieter, heavier anticipation. He stood at the center of a nation fighting for breath, holding up its spirit with sheer force of will. all while waiting for a sight he had dreamed of but never allowed himself to fully imagine. Columns of American soldiers marching through London, not as visitors, not as symbols, but as partners. In public, Churchill projected certainty. In private, he clung to hope. And somewhere in the space between those two states, certainty and hope, lay the fragile fate of Britain itself. On the morning of December 7, 1941, America was still a nation half asleep. Most citizens were going about an ordinary Sunday church, bells ringing, newspapers unfolding over breakfast tables, families planning quiet afternoons, when the radio broadcasts interrupted everything. The voice of the announcer trembled as he repeated the same impossible sentence. Japan had launched a massive attack on Pearl Harbor. In an instant, the illusion of distance evaporated. The Pacific suddenly felt as close as the neighbor's garden fence. The shock rippled through American households like a physical force. People who had spent years debating isolationism found their arguments crumbling under the sound of exploding battleships, broadcast over the airwaves. For years, the world across the Atlantic had burned, while the U.S. hesitated at the threshold, undecided. But that morning, hesitation died. The attack didn't just awaken anger, it awakened identity. A sense that the United States was no longer watching history unfold from a balcony seat but was being pulled violently onto the stage. And the world would soon learn that once America awakened, it awakened completely. Almost overnight, the mood across the United States shifted from wary distance to fierce determination. Men lined up at recruiting offices in numbers that stunned the government. Factories that only days before had been making automobiles or household goods now roared with the birth cries of tanks, aircraft, and ammunition. Women who had never worked industrial jobs stepped into overalls and seized the tools of wartime production with unapologetic efficiency. The transformation was astonishing. Not gradual, not hesitant, but immediate. It was as if the entire nation inhaled once, deeply, and exhaled purpose. President Roosevelt's Day of Infamy speech ignited a fire in the American public that no policy debate ever could. Congress declared war on Japan with only one dissenting vote, and within days, Germany and Italy declared war on the United States, dragging the nation not into one conflict, but into a global confrontation on both sides of the world. Some Americans felt fear. How could they not? But beneath it was something sharper, resolve, a national awareness that this war was no longer optional. It was personal. But while ordinary Americans felt the shift in their hearts, Winston Churchill felt it in his bones. When he heard the news, at Chequers, he didn't react like most of his cabinet, who flinched at the thought of escalating global conflict. Churchill simply whispered, "We have won." Not out of arrogance, but out of long-held conviction. He understood something most of the world had not yet realized. The war had just gained a new engine. One whose capacity dwarfed every other nation on earth. American industry, American manpower, American money. Churchill knew what that meant, even if it would take months before the rest of the world saw it. But conviction alone couldn't erase logistics. America was still oceans away. Mobilization took time. Troops had to be trained, ships built, strategies coordinated, and while the U.S. was awakening at dizzying speed, Churchill had lived through enough military planning to know that awakenings did not immediately translate to arrivals. He watched the American headlines with a strange mixture of exhilaration and fear. He knew they were coming. He just didn't know when. And for a nation already stretched thin, when could be the difference between endurance and collapse? Back in the United States, the emotional landscape of the country reshaped itself almost as dramatically as its factories. Isolationist voices that had dominated politics for years fell quiet, replaced by a unified sense of purpose. Hollywood actors enlisted. College students volunteered. Ordinary teenagers who had never seen the ocean found themselves boarding troop ships headed into the unknown. But even amid the patriotic swell, one truth lingered quietly. Most Americans had never been to Europe. They had never seen the ruins of Coventry, never heard the sirens of the Blitz, never felt the hunger of rationing or the terror of nightly air raids. They were entering a war they understood in principle, not in experience. Yet that inexperience came with a kind of raw power, the energy of a nation unscarred, unbroken, and ready to throw its full weight behind the fight. And as that force took shape, it began shifting the very balance of the global conflict. The world didn't know it yet, but Pearl Harbor did more than drag America into war. It began setting in motion the march of hundreds of thousands of young soldiers who would soon land in Britain, altering Churchill's fate, Britain's future, and the entire course of World War II. The awakening had begun. Now it was only a matter of time before Churchill would see it with his own eyes. Long before American boots ever touched British soil, the foundation of the alliance was being built in quiet rooms, late-night telegram exchanges, and moments of cautious trust between two leaders separated by an ocean. The relationship between Franklin D. Roosevelt and Winston Churchill was not born of convenience, it was forged out of necessity, strategy, and something neither man expected at first: genuine affection. Churchill began the courtship even before he became Prime Minister. sending Roosevelt letters signed former naval person, hoping a personal touch might penetrate the bureaucratic armor of Washington. He knew the United States was the only nation with the industrial muscle to match Germany, but he also knew American isolationism ran deep. So he didn't push, he coaxed, he charmed, he appealed to shared history, shared values, even shared language. The letters between the two men grew longer, warmer, increasingly direct. In a world where alliances were often transactional, this one began as something almost human. And Churchill, who rarely allowed himself to depend on anyone, began depending on Roosevelt. Roosevelt, for his part, watched Europe's collapse with frustration bordering on agony. He wanted to help Britain long before he could. American public opinion was fiercely divided, with many insisting the U.S. stay out of Europe's wars no matter the cost abroad. Roosevelt understood the political price of pushing too fast, too boldly. So he moved like a chess player, slow, careful, intentional. The Lend-Lease Act was his checkmate. It allowed the U.S. to send weapons, food, aircraft, and vehicles to Britain without technically entering the war. Churchill called it the most unsordid act in the whole of recorded history, and he meant it. British freighters arrived in American ports like beggars at a feast, leaving loaded with crates marked USA that might very well save Britain from starvation or defeat. But even as Churchill celebrated the lifeline, he understood its limits. Tanks and rifles were precious. Food was life-saving, but none of it could hold a rifle, storm a beach, or die in a trench. Supplies kept Britain alive. Soldiers would be needed to win the war. In December 1941, when Churchill finally met Roosevelt face-to-face at the White House, it was as if the correspondence from a long, emotional letter exchange suddenly stepped into the same room. Churchill later claimed he felt as if he had known Roosevelt all his life. The two men spoke for hours about strategy, about politics, about their own fears, weaving together the early blueprint of an alliance that would define the 20th century. But even in those warm, historic conversations, Churchill sensed the truth. America's entry into the war was not yet physically real. Not a single American division was in Europe. Not one. Their conversations were hopeful, their plans ambitious, but without troops, they were still just plans. Roosevelt warned him gently about the scale of American mobilization, the time required to train men, build ships, and prepare convoys. Churchill listened, nodding, but a knot sat in his stomach. Plans were comforting, presence was transformative, and Britain desperately needed the latter. Meanwhile, back in Britain, the public followed these diplomatic developments with a mixture of excitement and skepticism. Newspapers celebrated Roosevelt's promises and Lend-Lease shipments, but ordinary citizens still saw the same exhausted British regiments marching to the front lines. They still navigated rationing, still endured losses, still checked the sky at night. For the average Londoner, American involvement existed only in speeches and newspaper headlines, not in flesh and blood. And Churchill knew morale could not survive indefinitely on headlines alone. That was why, despite Roosevelt's warm assurances and the growing mountain of American supplies arriving in British ports, Churchill continued pushing, nudging, and urging the alliance from promise into physical reality. He believed wholly and without compromise that the future of the war depended on the moment when American soldiers would finally appear on British streets in their unmistakable uniforms. The alliance had begun on paper, in letters, in speeches, but it would only become real when Britain could look into the eyes of young Americans standing beside them, ready to fight. That moment was coming. Slowly, steadily, across thousands of miles of ocean. The long road to alliance was turning into a highway of ships bearing the future of the war. The first Americans to arrive in the British Isles didn't march through cheering crowds or pose for photographs. They came quietly, almost shyly, stepping off troop ships into the damp, gray chill of Northern Ireland on January 26, 1942. There were no brass bands waiting, no grand ceremonies, just a handful of British officers, a few curious dockworkers, and the distant echo of gulls circling above a coastline scarred by years of war. Most of these young Americans had never left their hometowns, let alone crossed an ocean haunted by U-boats. Their uniforms were crisp, their helmets still shining, their rifles barely scuffed. They looked almost out of place against the bleak austerity of wartime Britain. And yet, as they filed down the gangways, stamping their boots on British soil for the very first time, something enormous and invisible shifted. The abstract promise of American support had finally gained shape and breadth and footsteps. Churchill didn't see this first arrival in person, but when reports reached him that American troops had landed, even in small numbers, he paused. According to those nearby, closed his eyes, and exhaled as if releasing a portion of fear he'd been holding since 1940. But this early wave was only the beginning. Over the next months, troop ships continued to arrive at British ports, Belfast, Liverpool, Bristol, and others. The ships were not fancy. Many were converted passenger liners or cargo vessels hastily repurposed into floating barracks, packed so tightly with young men that privacy was a luxury no one remembered. Still, the moment they stepped onto British docks was transformative for both sides. Two British soldiers, weary from 2 relentless years of fighting, these newcomers seemed almost impossibly fresh, full of energy, jokes, and confidence. They walked with a swagger many British troops found baffling and oddly inspiring. To ordinary civilians, they looked like a glimpse of another world, well-fed, well-equipped, well-paid. But what stood out most wasn't the money or the gear. It was the youth. The Americans were so young that British mothers found themselves staring at them as though they were sons from a more peaceful universe. And even though these early troops were small in number, their presence whispered something Britain had desperately needed to hear. You are no longer alone. Still, their arrival wasn't without friction. American and British military cultures collided almost immediately. The British Army had been sharpened by combat, its humor dark, its discipline strict, its expectations shaped by sacrifice. The American soldiers, by contrast, carried a casual confidence that sometimes skated dangerously close to arrogance. They joked loudly, carried chocolate bars in their pockets, and spoke with accents that seemed to bounce compared to Britain's war-weary tones. British soldiers muttered that the Americans were green. Americans whispered that the British were old. Civilians didn't know what to make of the flood of gum-chewing, chimera-carrying foreigners who seemed stunned by Britain's gray skies and endless rationing. Yet even amid these tensions, connections formed quickly in pubs, in barracks, in the simple gestures of sharing cigarettes or navigating the cramped streets together. British children adored the Americans instantly. Many had never tasted chocolate before American soldiers handed out Hershey bars with a smile, and British young women, starved of romance in a country where so many men were away fighting, found the Americans exotic, charming, and heartbreakingly temporary. The first boots on the ground weren't just military reinforcement, they were cultural shockwaves. And all the while, Churchill monitored these arrivals with the obsessive attention of a man watching a lifeline slowly unfold. He studied reports detailing troop numbers, training progress, and the logistics of housing thousands of foreign soldiers on British soil. He asked his advisors for updates constantly, sometimes 2 or 3 times a day. But what he longed for was not a spreadsheet or a statistical report. It was the moment when these early arrivals would multiply into full regiments, full divisions, marching across Britain in numbers no one could ignore. He imagined the sight often, American uniforms moving through British streets, a physical declaration that Britain's long solitude was ending. He knew the British public needed that vision just as much as he did, because while the first boots on the ground were symbolically powerful, they were still a whisper, not yet a chorus. The tide of war was beginning to turn, but Britain had not yet seen the wave. That wave was coming, tens of thousands of young Americans crossing the Atlantic, then hundreds of thousands, and soon, over 1 million, bringing with them the strength, confidence, and industrial might that would reshape the war. These first arrivals were the spark. The coming months would bring the fire. By the spring of 1942, London lived in a strange kind of tension, not the fearful tension of the Blitz, not the exhausted tension of rationing or ruined streets, but something unfamiliar. Anticipation. Word had spread that more American troops were arriving across Britain, not just in quiet ports or remote bases, but in real numbers, in visible formations, in ways ordinary citizens would soon notice. People whispered about it in queues, in pubs, on trams. Children tried to guess what the Americans might look like. Would they be giants, movie stars, cowboys from the westerns playing in the picture houses? For a city that had survived 2 years of relentless threat, this kind of anticipation felt almost indulgent, almost dangerous, like hoping for sunshine after months of storm clouds. But Londoners couldn't help themselves. They needed evidence that the world was finally coming to stand beside them. Every rumor of American troop movements brought a flicker of excitement, a spark of something London hadn't felt in a long time. Curiosity untainted by fear. Yet curiosity came wrapped in anxiety. Britain had been at war for so long that the idea of sharing space, culturally, socially, emotionally, with an entire nation of fresh young soldiers was unsettling. British families weren't just preparing to meet allies. They were preparing to meet strangers. Londoners wondered how these Americans would behave, how they would fit in a city defined by restraint, understatement, and quiet endurance. Would they understand rationing, respect blackout rules, adapt to Britain's famously tight living spaces? British soldiers, meanwhile, worried about reputation. They knew Americans were wealthier, paid better, and supplied with rations that seemed almost luxurious compared to what Brits had endured. Many feared being overshadowed, replaced in their own homeland by confident newcomers with shiny boots and easy smiles. Even British women felt conflicted, excited, yes, at the idea of strangers from across the ocean, but also guilty at the thought of welcoming them too warmly while Britain's own men were fighting and dying abroad. The entire country hovered between eagerness and unease, outwardly calm but inwardly buzzing. And into this fragile atmosphere, the Americans began to appear. At first, it was subtle. A few unfamiliar voices laughing loudly outside a tea shop. A truck painted with American markings rumbling down a narrow London street. A cluster of young men in uniform peering curiously at a rationed bakery counter. Then, slowly, they became impossible to miss. They stood taller, spoke louder, and walked with the sort of relaxed posture that made British civilians both amused and envious. Their uniforms were cleaner, their faces less lined with worry. They treated London like a place to explore rather than endure. And that energy, that undeniable youthfulness, startled people. British children adored them instantly, running up to ask for gum or candy or simply to hear them talk. Older Londoners observed them with a mix of fondness and bewilderment, like watching a joyful species they thought had gone extinct. Even British policemen, usually masters of quiet authority, found themselves smiling more often in the presence of the enthusiastic newcomers. But beneath the smiles, something deeper stirred, a sense of relief that felt almost too fragile to fully trust. Yet for all the excitement, London still held its breath. For one thing, it had not yet seen a formal, unmistakably American military presence marching through its streets. Londoners could feel the Americans in pubs, in markets, in the banter on corners, but feeling wasn't the same as witnessing. What people longed for, what they whispered about in bus queues and crowded tube stations, was a vision powerful enough to quiet every lingering doubt. A full American contingent, marching in formation through the battered heart of the city. Something public, undeniable, cinematic. Something that would make even the most cynical Londoners straighten their back and think, they're here, really here. And as that expectation grew, Churchill felt it most acutely of all. He understood that such a moment wouldn't just boost morale, it would change history's momentum. The city waited. The people waited, and somewhere across the Atlantic, ships heavy with American divisions were already cutting through the waves, heading for a moment London had yearned for, since the darkest nights of 1940. It happened on a gray London afternoon, the kind of muted, smoky sky the city had worn like a permanent cloak since the Blitz. Streets still bore the scars of bombings, shattered brickwork, boarded windows, the skeletons of buildings that once held families, shops, laughter. Yet on this particular day, something felt different in the air, a quiet buzz rolling through the city like the first rumble before a long-awaited storm. Office workers leaned out of cracked windows. Shopkeepers abandoned their tills. Children tugged at their mothers' sleeves, begging to see what everyone was whispering about. Then, faint at first, a sound drifted down the street, rhythmic, steady, impossible to mistake. Footsteps, not hurried, not dragging, not weary, like the familiar footfalls of British troops worn down by years of war. These were confident, synchronized, powerful, and as the sound grew louder, the crowd's murmur grew with it. Londoners pressed forward, filling sidewalks, perching on steps, craning their necks. For the first time in the entire war, the city was about to witness something it had only imagined. American soldiers, not in scattered groups, not strolling individually, but marching in formation through the capital. They appeared around the bend like a wave of youth and strength Britain hadn't seen in years. Columns of American infantrymen, clean uniforms, polished helmets, rifles carried with energized precision, moving in tight formation. They were unmistakably foreign, yet instantly familiar in the way hope is familiar even when you haven't felt it in a long time. Their faces were young, shockingly young. Farm boys from the Midwest, factory workers from Detroit, students from New York, all marching with a relaxed confidence that contrasted sharply with London's hardened edges. As they passed, the crowd's mood shifted from curiosity to astonishment to something deeper, something that made Londoners swallow hard. These men hadn't grown up listening to air raid sirens. They hadn't huddled in shelters or sifted through rubble searching for treasures of a vanished, normal life. They were fresh, untouched by the particular kind of exhaustion that only long, lonely war creates. And yet, they were here. They had crossed thousands of miles to stand beside a battered ally, bringing with them the one thing Britain had nearly run out of time. Somewhere along the route, just far enough from the crowd to observe without disrupting, Winston Churchill stood and watched. He had insisted on being there, not for publicity, not for ceremony, but because he needed to see this with his own eyes. His staff tried to stand discreetly around him, but their presence hardly mattered. Everyone near the Prime Minister could see the emotion rising in him. His face, usually set like granite, softened. His shoulders, always held stiff with authority and responsibility, seemed to ease. His eyes glistened, not with spectacle but with release, the release of a man who had carried a nation's fate alone for too long. As the columns marched past, Churchill didn't blink. He absorbed every face, every step, every echo of American youth, marching through a city that had been bombed, bruised, and stretched to its limit. He said nothing at first. Those nearby didn't dare interrupt him. This was the moment he had imagined during sleepless nights at Chequers, during telegram exchanges with Roosevelt, during the darkest hours of the Blitz when invasion seemed certain. It was finally unfolding, not in theory, not on paper, but right before him, alive, tangible, unstoppable. Only when someone nervously asked, "Prime Minister, what do you think?" did Churchill speak. His voice was low at first, thick with emotion. Then it steadied, carrying the weight of 2 years of wartime leadership and 2 years of silent fear. "When I see these young men," he said, watching yet another column stride past, "I know we are going to win this war." It was a simple sentence, but to those who heard it, it felt as if the sky itself had brightened. Churchill wasn't a man prone to easy optimism. He dealt in harsh truths and hard calculations. So if he said the words, "we are going to win," it wasn't for show. It was because something inside him, some burden, some terror, some relentless grinding question, had finally eased. The Americans kept marching, and Churchill kept watching, his eyes wet, his jaw set, his belief unshakable now. The city around him seemed to inhale as if awakening from a long, terrible sleep. London had endured. Britain had endured, and now, at last, they were no longer enduring alone. The march ended, but its meaning did not. For Churchill, for Britain, and for the war itself, this was the moment the tide truly began to turn, not in a strategy room, not on a battlefield, but on a battered London street where hope arrived, marching in perfect step. Churchill's statement, "I know we are going to win this war," wasn't merely emotional. It wasn't a flourish of morale-building rhetoric. It was a declaration rooted in calculation, memory, and the brutal math of global conflict. For 2 years, Churchill had lived inside those calculations, running them silently through his mind during late-night cabinet meetings, while pacing the halls of Chequers, even while delivering speeches that masked the gnawing uncertainty beneath his voice. Britain had been fighting a war it could not afford to lose, yet could not fully win alone. Every loss of a ship in the Atlantic, every costly battle in North Africa, every air raid casualty chipped away at the finite reserves Britain possessed. Churchill understood what the public did not always see. Nations do not win wars on courage alone. They win them through industry, manpower, sustained logistics, and the sheer ability to outlast the enemy. And until that day on the London street, Britain had been outlasting, not advancing. Watching those American columns, Churchill wasn't just moved, he was vindicated. The missing variable in his wartime equations had finally taken human form. The United States was no longer a promise or a policy. It was an army. But his words carried something deeper than strategic assurance. They carried the exhaustion of a man who had spent 18 months waking every day to the possibility that this might be the day Britain's luck finally ran out. His belief in ultimate victory had always been unwavering in public, because it had to be. But leaders are not stone. They crack in private, they doubt in silence, they feel the erosion of each loss in ways the public can't imagine. Churchill bore that erosion with a stubbornness bordering on obsession. He refused to consider surrender, refused to imagine defeat, refused to let the British people glimpse the terror he sometimes felt. Yet even the strongest will cannot erase weariness. On countless nights, he had stood by maps littered with pins, marking German advances, knowing that if Britain fell, the world would descend into darkness. He had heard the Luftwaffe bomb London for 57 nights straight. He had read letters from families who had lost everything. His own doctor had warned that the stress might kill him before the enemy did, and still, he pressed on. So when he uttered those words, "I know we are going to win this war," it wasn't just a prediction. It was a release, an exhale from the deepest part of his being. For those standing near him, the shift in Churchill's demeanor was unmistakable. His tone changed. His posture straightened. He spoke with a certainty that was not theatrical, not performative, but almost serene. He watched the Americans march with a gaze that blended admiration with something more personal, gratitude. They were young, vibrant, unscarred by the years of hardship Britain had weathered. And Churchill, a man who had seen 2 world wars shape and shatter entire generations, understood exactly what their youth represented. Time to rebuild, time to fight, time to throw the full weight of American production and manpower into the conflict. He saw, in their faces, the future soldiers who would storm beaches, liberate towns, hold the line in forests and mountaintops, march across rivers under fire, and eventually cross into Germany itself. Many would never return home. Churchill knew that too, and it weighed on him. But their presence meant something Britain had not dared believe since 1940. The war was no longer a desperate act of survival. It was a path to victory. The men around Churchill would never forget the shift in him that day. The haunted urgency that had lived in his eyes for so long seemed to lift, replaced by something steadier, stronger. It wasn't naive optimism. Churchill was far too seasoned for that, but a calm conviction that history had pivoted. He didn't sugarcoat the challenges ahead. He knew the war would still demand unimaginable sacrifices. He knew the Battle of the Atlantic raged on, Nazi submarines prowling the seas with merciless efficiency. He knew the Soviets were locked in a colossal struggle in the East, and that D-Day, though not yet fully imagined, would one day require courage on a scale the world had rarely seen. But now, for the first time, he believed victory was not just possible but inevitable. Not because Britain's strength had changed, but because Britain's loneliness had ended. Those marching Americans represented the full promise of the alliance he had fought, begged, and maneuvered so tirelessly to build. When Churchill said, "We are going to win this war," he wasn't looking at the enemy, he was looking at the future. And for the first time in years, it looked brighter than the past. As more American divisions poured into Britain, something remarkable, and occasionally chaotic, began to unfold. Two armies with entirely different cultures, histories, and temperaments were suddenly expected to train, plan, and fight as one. It wasn't smooth at first. The British Army, shaped by centuries of tradition, approached war with a kind of disciplined melancholy, strict routines, dry humor, and a respect for hierarchy so ingrained it seemed carved into their uniforms. The Americans, by contrast, carried an energy that was equal parts enthusiasm and impatience. They were bold, informal, sometimes reckless, and always loud in the eyes of their British counterparts. British officers found American tactics puzzlingly aggressive. American officers found British caution frustratingly slow. And yet, beneath the friction, the beginnings of a powerful partnership took root. British soldiers respected the Americans' eagerness. Americans admired the British soldiers' resilience, their ability to endure hardships without complaint. Slowly, through shared drills, late-night campfire conversations, and grueling training exercises, admiration replaced irritation. What began as a collision of cultures was quietly turning into something stronger: camaraderie. That camaraderie deepened in Britain's training grounds, the muddy fields, cold beaches, and makeshift camps where both armies prepared for the wars ahead. British veterans from North Africa and the Mediterranean taught Americans what desert warfare demanded: how to march long distances with blistered feet, how to keep morale alive when the sun was unforgiving and resources thin. Americans, in turn, brought their own strengths, mechanical expertise, new technologies, and an infectious optimism that lifted even the most battle-hardened British units. When American engineering units rolled in with sparkling vehicles and heavy machinery, British troops joked that it was like watching war meet the future. And when British instructors demonstrated bayonet drills or explained the realities of facing German panzer divisions, the Americans listened with a seriousness that surprised their teachers. Each side realized they had something essential to give, something the other lacked. They were not rivals. They were puzzle pieces, mismatched at first glance, but perfectly fitted when placed together. Off the training grounds, the alliance took shape in ways no war manual could ever predict. In pubs, American soldiers bought rounds they could barely afford. British soldiers returned the gesture with stories of the Blitz and lessons in London slang. British families invited Americans into their cramped, rationed homes for Sunday roasts that stretched ingredients to their limits, meals that felt like feasts simply because they were shared. British children took to the Americans immediately, not just for the chocolate bars and chewing gum, but for their warmth and curiosity. The Americans, many of whom had left small towns where everyone knew everyone, found comfort in these adopted families. And while tensions occasionally flared over pay differences, over cultural misunderstandings, over the inevitable competition for attention from local girls, the clashes gradually became background noise. What endured were the friendships, the unlikely bonds forged in a country still bearing the wounds of war, in cold train stations and muddy training fields, in pubs crowded with laughter that felt astonishingly normal amid global conflict. These human connections became the glue of the alliance, evidence that cooperation wasn't just a strategic necessity, but a shared desire. All of this, the training, the bonding, the clashing, the learning, was preparation for the moment both armies understood was coming. The day when they would fight, not side by side, in theory, but shoulder to shoulder, in blood and fire. Churchill watched the alliance strengthen with growing relief and pride. He had always believed that the English-speaking world could stand united, that Britain's experience and America's strength would form a force powerful enough to reshape the war. Now he could see it happening in the synchronized drills, in the shared jokes, in the cross-national friendships forming in villages across Britain. As American troops learned to navigate British terrain and follow British commanders, and as British officers adjusted to American speed and creativity, the alliance that would storm North Africa, Sicily, Italy, and eventually Normandy was taking shape. This was no longer a partnership built on political speeches or diplomatic promises. It was real, it was human, and it was ready. Britain had stood alone for long enough. Now at last, it stood shoulder to shoulder with a brother. Different in voice and temperament, yes, but united in purpose. A brother who had crossed an ocean to help liberate a continent. A brother who would soon share in the cost and glory of the battles to come. The sight of American troops marching through London was more than a morale boost. It was the first visible thread of a massive tapestry still being woven. Over the next 2 years, Britain became a fortress of preparation, the beating heart of the Allied war machine. Trains rattled through the countryside carrying soldiers, engineers, medics, mechanics, a seemingly endless tide of American manpower. Airfields expanded overnight. Ports were clogged with Liberty ships and cargo vessels packed with everything from ammunition to canned peaches. British villages swelled with accents from Michigan, Texas, New Jersey, and Oklahoma. Everywhere you looked, the landscape transformed. Fields once quiet now echoed with the engines of tanks maneuvering through mud. Coastlines bristled with barbed wire and concrete defenses. Every road, every courtyard, every disused quarry became a training ground. Britain had become one vast rehearsal stage for the greatest military operation the world had ever attempted. And though ordinary civilians could not see the full scope of what was unfolding, they could feel it, the sense of gathering momentum, of something enormous approaching on the horizon. The planning was meticulous, painstaking, almost impossible in its scale. Allied generals debated, argued, scrapped entire strategies, and built new ones in their place. The question wasn't whether to invade Nazi-occupied Europe, it was how to do it without condemning tens of thousands of young men to unnecessary death. Churchill pushed relentlessly, often advocating for attacks through what he called the soft underbelly of Europe, while American leaders like General George Marshall pressed for a direct assault across the English Channel. Ultimately, the logic of geography prevailed. France was the doorway to Germany, and the English Channel was the threshold that had to be crossed. And so the Allies began constructing a military miracle. They built artificial harbors, floating roads, and amphibious vehicles unlike anything ever used before. They mapped tides and winds, studied German fortifications, rehearsed landings under live fire, and trained troops until exhaustion blurred into instinct. Every drill, every briefing, every sleepless night of planning was a step toward the single day that would decide the fate of Europe. And all the while, Churchill kept returning to that moment in London, that march of young Americans, as a reminder of what was possible now, that Britain did not stand alone. By 1944, over 1.5 million American soldiers were stationed in Britain. Entire towns felt like extensions of American cities. The promise Churchill had witnessed in those early columns had grown into an overwhelming physical force. And when the time finally came, June 6, 1944, the world witnessed the result of 2 years of preparation, sacrifice, and unity. D-Day was not a battle. It was a leap of faith against almost impossible odds. Thousands of ships crossed the Channel in the largest amphibious invasion in human history. American, British, Canadian, and Allied soldiers stormed ashore under brutal machine gun fire, wading through cold water, churning with fear and resolve. Many fell before they could touch the sand. Many pressed forward despite wounds that should have stopped them, and yet they advanced. Slowly, painfully, inch by inch, they secured a foothold on the beaches of Normandy. It was the moment when the alliance Churchill had fought so desperately to build revealed its true strength. Men from opposite sides of the Atlantic fighting as one, bleeding as one, breaking through the Atlantic wall together. And when the sun set on that historic day, the path to liberating Europe had finally opened. The final push into Germany was long and costly, but the momentum was irreversible. Allied forces liberated Paris, crossed the Rhine, and closed in on Berlin while the Soviets advanced from the east. Hitler's empire crumbled under the combined weight of armies that had begun as strangers and become brothers. And when victory finally came, first in Europe, then in the Pacific, Churchill's words on that London street resonated with a clarity history would never forget. "I know we are going to win this war." It had not been optimism. It had been foresight. Because the moment Churchill watched those young Americans march past him, he understood something fundamental. Victory is not won by speeches, or hope, or endurance alone. It is won by unity, by nations willing to share the weight of war, by soldiers willing to cross oceans, by allies who see each other's battles as their own. That march through London was not a parade. It was a promise that Britain would never again stand alone, a promise that the world, battered and bruised, would find its strength in partnership, and a promise that the darkest nights of war would give way, eventually and inevitably, to dawn.